People are joining. Hi, everyone. Just getting Charwei on with me, so. Okay, I've invited Charwei to join. There
Hi,
you go.
sorry, it took me a while. I found it.
No worries at all. That was pretty quick. We weren't sure if we were going to get there, but looks good. I'm just going to back up. I'm a bit close to the camera.
Okay.
Thanks so much for joining. We've got a few people already coming online to say hello, which is great. And thanks. I know it's 10 p.m. there, Charwei, so thank you so much for joining. Um,
Thank you.
For everyone just joining, this is the Bagri Foundation Open Up series. I'm Chelsea Pettit. I'm head of arts at the Bagri Foundation, and this is our second one with the fantastic artist Charwei Tsai, whose work I've been following for a number of years. And I'm really excited to talk to Charwei about what really drives her practice, because this series has really been created at a time of really incredible moment in history. And we felt it was kind of a fitting opportunity to speak to artists from across the world who are dealing with this in different ways through their practice, through their studio, and just get a bit of a glimpse into their work and who they are. So just a quick bio for Charwei, for anyone who doesn't know her work. She was born in 1980 in Taipei, Taiwan, and is living and working there at the moment. She explores highly personal yet universal concerns through a multimedia practice. So there's installation, video, drawing, and also performance as well. And she touches upon the human nature kind of relationship, spiritual motifs, geographical and social issues, complexities around cultural beliefs, spirituality and transience. And she's had many solo exhibitions as well as group exhibitions and has been part of biennials around the world. So lots there to sink into. And I hope in the next 30 to 40 minutes that if anyone has questions, please send them through. You can wait to the end potentially, because we might miss them if they come in too early. So let's get started. Charwei, could you tell us a little bit about your daily routine in the studio, but also how that has changed or how that's been impacted over the past few months?
Um, it has impacted me a lot. The pandemic has impacted me a lot because in Taiwan it arrived a bit earlier. So since February, I haven't been traveling at all, which is really rare. And I guess for many, for most people, for working in the art world. And then so um, since then, I had a lot more time in my studio and a lot more time reading and focusing.
Mm-hmm.
And so actually for me personally, it has been a really creative time.
Well, that's great. So in terms of the studio itself, could you give us a bit of a glimpse into what you might have been working on during this period and maybe how you used the studio before?
Oh, okay. Do you want me to show you before?
Yeah, if you don't mind. Sure.
So, um, so here's my studio. And actually, my studio is quite active. I've always hosted a lot of workshops for people. Sometimes when they pass by Taipei, they don't have a space for like festivals or for different organizations who need a space. And then we
Mhm.
would meet here, and also I host some screenings, like last year, we had a group of people who really wanted to propose a project in Iran with funding from the Taiwan government. So
Mhm.
we had screenings of Iranian films here, and then again later we had a group from Taiwan going to a conference in Mongolia. So we wanted to get to know Mongolia before we go. So we
Mhm.
also have some film screenings here, and also
That's great.
and then yeah, a meditation group also borrows the space on the weekends.
A meditation group on the weekend. That's so interesting. So is you handing over your sort of studio space for these kinds of things, is that because there are not a lot of maybe project space type of places in Taiwan? In Taipei, sorry?
No, actually, we have a lot of artist space, but I'm quite lucky. My place is really centrally located, so it's very easy because in Taipei a lot of things are very spread out.
Mm-hmm.
So I found a former government project housing that's next to the Sea Lab, which is a new Air Force space, and it's really convenient for everyone to get to.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
That's
so
great.
that's part of the reason.
Yeah. No, it's really nice to see a studio that's got so many uses as well. And of course, I'm over the moon about all the books that I'm seeing everywhere. You can't go wrong in a place like that. So in terms of the research you said you've been doing lately, can you talk a little bit more about what that's been about?
Yeah, sure. I felt quite fortunate that in the last year, when I was able to travel around, I did. I'll show you the map. It's easier to see.
Okay.
I did. Is it? Can you see it well?
Yeah, I can see that. It's yeah.
I did a series of pilgrimage. Actually, initially, some were for personal trips and some were for work trips. But I ended up kept going back to Indonesia, and then for work I was in Mongolia, and then for personal pilgrimage I went to Japan, and then I was trying to think of how I could link all these places with so much such different cultural heritage together. And then I realized that the tradition of Buddhism that I'm studying, the Tantric Buddhism tradition, which started to really flourish in Nalanda University in India in the 8th century. All the when at the time when it was like a mini renaissance that happened for Buddhism at the Nalanda University, and then so the people they spread the furthest north towards Mongolia, and then spread the furthest south in Java, and then the furthest east to Japan. And so these were really the three places I was spending the most time in last year. And then so I started to do pilgrimages in these places, like tracing the Tantric tradition, which is actually it's not so present anymore. And then so yeah, go ahead.
It's interesting because as you probably know, the Bagri Foundation has sponsored the Tantra Exhibition at British Museum, which is currently not open yet. So we haven't seen it yet, but it's been interesting to see your practice too, which has a Buddhist link, at least historically, with the Heart Sutras in your performances. But now having you also now sort of studying and mapping out some Tantra Buddhist principles, how is that manifesting in your work, do you think, so far?
I think with the Tantric, studying Tantric Buddhism, it's just everything happens really, everything manifests in a very unexpected way. But and right now, like the next series I will be focusing on are these mandalas that I'm studying. And they also start, I think it was brought to Japan through by a monk, Kukai, and then he kind of spread it in Koyasan. Well, he had a base in Japan in Koyasan. And I think the reason why I relate so much to this tradition is because unlike some other Buddhist traditions, which is really analytical and scientifically minded,
Mm-hmm.
Because me personally, I feel like I perceive things more visually and through sound and through the senses.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, um, like visiting Koyasan in Japan and watching all the rituals that they do with the fire and the drumming and the mandalas and all of that, I feel like that's a much more direct way for me to receive these teachings and these
Mm-hmm.
transmissions more than
Mm-hmm.
through studying a text
Yeah,
and
I suppose that.
and analyzing like very critically, how where the mind is, and how we perceive like object and subject and these kind of things.
Well, that's a nice segue into one of the questions I wanted to ask you, because having had a sort of Buddhist or Tantric interest, there's a spirituality, of course, that runs through it. And I find the spiritual being such a personal endeavor, I guess, a certain higher plane or a way of existing that kind of works its way through your entire body, every way that you think about things. Do you consider, and you must be asked this question all the time, do you consider yourself to be a spiritual person? And how do you feel about that, such a personal journey or a personal endeavor being made public through your work?
um I consider myself as like a student of this, of the spiritual journey. And then, and I think it just happened that, I mean, I grew up in a Buddhist environment. Taiwan is very much like a fusion of Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism. And so, and all the philosophies of these traditions, they're very much a part of our day-to-day life. So it's like considered less as a religion, but more like just a way of living, I think.
Mm.
And then, so so for the first time that and my family is not particularly religious.
Okay.
So but for the exhibition, like the first time I had a chance to exhibit, I was recommended to Cartier Foundation for a young artist exhibition by the Chinese artist Cai Guoqiang. And I had told him about this idea of writing Buddha Sutra, which is the only text that I had memorized since I was little.
And
Onto
why did you memorize it when you were little? Was it something through your family or through school, or how did that come about?
Actually, I don't know. I don't know
You know?
why and how I memorized it. I mean, it's not a really long text, but it's not a simple text either.
Mm.
So I'm not sure like why I had it memorized, but it reads like a poem.
Mm-hmm.
And then so I had the idea of writing this text about impermanence onto ephemeral materials. And then so my personal journey, it did start in a public way, in the way that I was writing this text. Actually, I couldn't finish the work because Tsai likes to work really big, so he suggests me, oh, just find the biggest piece of tofu you can. And then so I was still writing when the audience started to come in, and it became a performance.
Mm-hmm.
So like my journey of this work as a performance started like that. And then through all these exhibitions, I started to look deeper and deeper into the text.
Yeah. And so it sounds almost like then the performance of writing a sutra that you'd memorized, you weren't totally sure why, and your parents aren't particularly religious, that was the sort of beginning of you discovering or using art as a way of discovering your own sort of spiritual side, and that you're still on that journey now. That's interesting. You mentioned impermanence, and this came up because our trustee Alka Bagri has studied Tantra Buddhism before, which is part of the reason why we were interested in British Museum's exhibition. The idea of impermanence, does that change? Maybe you can't quite answer this. Maybe I answer this, but does that change the way that you are viewing what's going on in the world now?
Yes, for sure. It's so, I think it happened really immediately when this pandemic started to happen. Like right away, I stopped planning so far in advance like I used to. Like I used to always plan at least a year ahead because I know all my schedules already, like exhibition
Yeah.
schedule, usually about a year in advance. And I
Yeah.
just stopped planning ahead naturally, and I just stopped thinking so much into the future. And
Mm.
I started to think more into the past. I think it's just
Oh.
like I started to I really started to go into more introspection because I have more quiet time and have more solitude.
Mm-hmm.
And then and then and then I felt like the solitude actually opened me up more. Like I felt towards other people.
Oh, interesting.
Like I felt more open towards other people than I was before after having so much time alone. And I think just giving more space to myself. So like the few friends that I'm in touch with, they're like in Mexico or in India where the situation is really really bad. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
like I feel actually a stronger connection than even before.
Mm. Yeah, it's almost odd that I suppose the more time you spend alone, the more you realize how much you need people. I think at the beginning, um, I maybe some people felt, okay, I can do this for a little while. You know, I can enjoy the solitude, like you said, get in your own head, think about the world, nature, people getting their hands stuck into, you know, dirt and gardening and growing and a lot of other creative things as well. And now it's gone on in the UK for so long that I think people are desperate for human connection again, and it does make you
Mm.
realize that the physical that this is fantastic that you can speak to people across the world and really enjoy this, but the reality of not having an atmosphere of other bodies around you and other humans is taking its toll. And obviously, we're just very social people. I think ultimately
Yeah.
that's what people are, social animals. Um, but speaking of people, that's a really weak segue, but I'll go with it. In terms of some of the communities that you've worked with, you've documented some fantastic pieces of music, singing. And again, I'm
Mm.
thinking about how these people sang from memory. It looks like in most of these examples, they're singing these songs that they know by heart. And I'll just name some of the works, and I can write them up on Instagram later. Songs of Chuchapati Camp from the Nepalese earthquake victims, songs of the migrant workers of Kaohsiung Harbor in Taiwan, and then Hear Her Singing, the collection of songs by women asylum seekers that was showing here in the UK at Southbank Centre. Why songs, and how did you come across those communities?
Oh, it started when I was I was doing a workshop in Nepal in Kathmandu. I was invited by the new school in New York, and then in and then during that trip, I was interested to meet the teacher of my Buddhist teacher, he's a Tibetan yogi, and he's very famous for being very scholarly. Like he has a lot of knowledge, like
Mm,
academic knowledge, as well as being a really accomplished yogi. And then
mm,
he continued this tradition where of transmitting his knowledge, his spiritual realization through singing. And then so
mm,
I was very interested to meet him. And then after I met him, and then during the same trip, I came across the earthquake victims camp. It's a makeshift camp in the middle of Kathmandu. And then and I was interested to I invited them to sing as a way to express their current situation. So instead of like an interview, which I didn't feel comfortable with because I didn't spend so much time there, I felt like sharing songs was a much more spontaneous way of revealing their situation through the songs and the emotions. And then so that's how this series of work started, and then continued to London, and then to Taiwan.
Well, it's interesting. I think what it sort of made me realize was that song, maybe similarly to food, is this kind of international uniter that everybody has some kind of song that can capture them or their culture, who they are or how they're feeling, and it creates a really interesting and moving understanding of their situation. So yeah, that's a really nice story that the Buddhist monk or Buddhist teacher, I should say, that you had utilized song in that way. That's really lovely. Well, one other thing I really love about your work is that, in a sense, it sort of feels ethnographic. It's capturing these moments in time and these cultural these important cultural, I suppose, elements of somebody's life. And I just wonder if I'd love to know who has influenced you, if there's any other artists or writers or someone who's had a major influence on your work.
I think, well, when I was living in New York, definitely it was the Fluxes. Because I could relate so much to their work because I come from Asia, but like my culture is much more Asian based. But then like I study in the US since like high school. So my background is kind of mixed in that way. And then with the Fluxes, I really felt like it helped me to connect with like the Eastern traditions that I come from, and with contemporary art.
Great.
And then also the land artists like Robert Smithson, especially Robert Smithson. And his essays are just so beautiful.
I suppose there's also an ephemerality to some of the works that he was creating and making that also had an impermanence to them. So yeah, I can see that kind of connection. Great. Well, I think it might be time for me to hit you with some of these probing questions, as I had sent to you previously. So let's see what's important to you. So I'm going to start with, if you could be remembered for one thing, what would it be?
As Buddhists, it's like the exact opposite of our practice.
You're right. These are very Western questions, I guess.
But I mean, I would like, I don't know, if it's like any sort of positive benefit to someone, if my work would have that effect, that would, I think that's, for me, for sure, that is the most important by far.
Good. And you might have already touched upon this, but what would you say was a turning point for you in your life? Maybe it was the award, or maybe it was visiting, your Buddhist teacher. Could you pinpoint a real turning point where you thought, this is who I am, this is what I want to do?
I think it was the first time that I exhibited as an artist. And because I think I was in my early 20s. I haven't graduated. I graduated from school. I haven't had that much life experience. And then I just felt like being an artist, because I was not sure about what I was doing. So the first time I was exhibiting an artist, I felt like everything was so natural to me. Like the way of working, the way of thinking, and the amount of freedom that I had. And also like just traveling to a different place and feeling the different inspirations, and then meeting all sorts of people from like very different cultures. I felt like it just felt, I felt so at ease.
Mm.
And I
And
felt really blessed to continue to have this life as an artist.
yeah, it's interesting because I suppose there's an element of cultural anthropology, which I studied. And I remember thinking, similar to you, I can either go down this very, which in my mind was scientific, scientific route of anthropological study, or I can go down a sort of creative route where you also then have this freedom to continue to research and study and look at things. But there's almost artistic interpretation that we're allowed to have in a creative space that you can't have in a sort of anthropological space. So I could see how you might, yeah, sort of feel free having had that experience as an artist to start to expand on your interests in any way that felt natural, which is amazing. Makes me want to be an artist. I don't know, I couldn't do it.
No, but I must say that before the pandemic, I was starting to feel exhibition fatigue. I was starting to feel like, oh, I'm not doing the same thing, and like things start to feel like more of a routine.
Yeah.
And then the pandemic happened. Then I was like, I stopped to take things for granted. I realized, like, in the middle of the pandemic, there was an exhibition that I was participating in Seoul, that I started really appreciate, wow, like how much effort everybody's putting into making this happen. And because I wasn't able to be there to install, so like the whole museum or the art center staff, they're all like really so thoughtful about how to install without me being there, and then to make sure that it's exactly what I wanted and all of this. And then I start to appreciate everything much more again.
Oh, good.
I mean, all these problems that's happening now with the gender issue, the race issue, equality issue, the migrants and environmental issue, like all these things have been around, forever. But I felt like somehow now people, like even just around me, like friends that never really cared about this so much before, I think like they're becoming much more like actively proactive with these issues in their own lives and in their own communities. So I felt like it is a good time for these kind of changes too.
Yeah, I think there was there was a real shift, to use the word of Halime, our project manager, who's probably watching. There was a real shift when the pandemic hit, in everybody's psyche and everybody's existences. And as you said, you start to really feel that, okay, I need to rethink the way I'm doing everything now. Not only the way shows happen, exhibitions happen, but how you even communicate with friends. So it felt like a better time than ever that people now have the energy to focus on what is actually happening in the world around them. And even if it's, late, at least it is here, and hopefully it's something that's being maintained. Another shift is happening now, and let's hope that this is really going to I don't know, see something that will last, longevity. I hope. But yeah, there's also one question I always love to ask, and afterwards, hopefully, you can send us maybe a few things that you're reading or watching. Is there something you would recommend that everybody must read or watch, or listen to before we die? What's the kind of big thing that you would recommend?
The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying.
Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. Awesome. That's a good one.
It really helped me, like when I was going through my grandmother's death, and then there's just so much death and sickness that's happening. I mean, especially now, but it's always been that way as well. It's just now that it's much more in our face, and then it really presses me to think about the time. I mean, the when we're alive, and to really appreciate like how like because one of the main like Buddhist teaching, it's called the Four Reminders, and it's something that I've always read, but it never stuck with me until this time. And then the first reminder is the precious human body and the precious human life, and how difficult it is to have. I mean, just even to be conceived and then to be brought up with a healthy life and mind. And then, but how easily that can be lost.
Do you think that it almost for you took a level of grief to appreciate the book, and that now is that time where there's so much grief in the world that collectively we would all learn something from it?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I felt like, because I felt like before my grandmother's death, like maybe suffering to me is more like bourgeois suffering. So I can't have this today, or I can't do this, I can't go there. You know, it's not nothing that's that bad.
It's put things into perspective.
But working not at my grandma's death, and also this past few years of working with different communities. I mean, even now during the pandemic, like, I have the luxury for self-reflection, but then a lot of the communities that I work with, like the asylum seekers in UK, they're really like, I mean, even just food and shelter, these basic needs are an issue for them.
Yeah.
So
it's important to it is important to remember those things also when people do start venturing out again, to not just forget about all the people who are still struggling and will continue to struggle after the effects of the pandemic worldwide.
Yeah. So
well, I'll just ask a couple more. Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh no, I feel like I ruined the moment.
No, I don't. Go ahead.
Oh, I'll just ask a couple more questions. I think we're coming up on about 35 minutes now. What would you change about the art world if you could? And again, we might have touched upon some of these things.
Actually, for me, it would be to be less professional.
Less professional?
Like, since I started, I don't know, I started working art 15 years ago. And things were much more relaxed. Like, and artists were much more creative, I felt like. I feel like now it's almost like sometimes I feel like a production company. I mean, I'm a one-person studio, but I felt like what I'm expected to do is almost like a production company. Like, everything has to be so professional and so formal and so institutional. And I kind of miss the times before I think the art market bloomed, maybe. Also relationships with each other, like with the colleagues, is much more relaxed and less competitive and more human in a way, like more personal. And then, I mean, I think that I publish a art journal, and that's kind of my whole point in the journal, like how to we like as artists we can relate, how we relate to each other in a very personal, a very subjective way, and not everything needs to be so formal, I guess.
Oh, that's a nice answer. It's funny because I would almost think that with social media and people's easy access to just putting things out there, that you don't really need to be that formal. But I think you're right, in presenting in a gallery or something, there's extremely high expectations. Yeah, totally. So it is, And like you said,
I feel like the more spontaneous approach to work, it doesn't need to compromise on the quality of the work. But sometimes actually being too professional, I think that compromises the authenticity and the spontaneity of the work. So
Yeah.
that's what I don't mean to be like for artists to all be sloppy and be like hippies, but more like I kind of miss the spontaneity of the artists like in the
Yeah.
70s, the 60s,
Sure, yeah. Putting on
and the
your own
artist
performance.
community.
Mm-hmm.
And not all the works need to be up on the wall. You know, it can be something that people are just sharing with each other.
Yeah. Well, hopefully that's what you're able to manifest in your studio with a space where people come in and, you can have that freedom a bit. Um, well, I guess the last couple questions. What would you say is the most extravagant thing that you own?
It's what I own and what I desperately want to get rid of is my wedding dress. I had like a Oscar de la Renta wedding dress, like, and it was like one of his last designs before he
Wow.
passed away. And
Okay.
and then now I just can't wait to get rid of it because
Get
it's
rid of it.
taking up so much place in my closet. And
Okay.
actually during this time I just want to get rid of things.
Yeah, I know what
Especially
you
things
mean.
that are useful. And
Yeah.
old wedding dress is just the most useless thing.
I was not expecting that answer, so that's that's good. That's good. This is why I ask these questions because you just never know. But that leads nicely to our final question. What would you save if your studio or house were on fire?
I mean, I I think I'll show you. I
Oh,
showed
cool.
you I think when we chatted. I didn't think I'm that. I mean, I'm not that attached to things that I own, but
Hmm.
this photograph of
Oh,
Dalai Lama making a mandala um, is a gift from his niece, his niece, that who I met, and
mm,
so this is a really rare print that I have. I think this would be the one thing that I would try to say.
that's lovely. And it was a gift, so that's really sweet.
Yeah.
Well,
It
now's
also
the
makes
time.
us realize it's never the thing that's the most obvious, I think.
Exactly. That's why it's nice to sort of rest with these questions for a little while and think, actually, what would it be? I haven't done that yet for myself. Maybe the final interview I can answer some of these for myself. Um, now is the time for questions from anybody who has been listening and maybe wants you to expand on anything. So we'll give it a sec for anything to kind of pop up. But I hope everyone's enjoyed the conversation. I've really enjoyed it, Charwei. It's been great to talk about the complexities of all the different works you've been making. We've got one from Annie. How do you navigate xenophobia and restrictions placed upon you as an East Asian woman? Have you experienced any of that directly or in working with other institutions or anything? Good question, Annie.
Actually, I feel more as a woman, less as an Asian. Because I guess
Mm,
I have a kind of generic Asian face. Like I could be from Southeast Asia or from Himalayas. Um, but more as a woman, I always feel like sometimes I'm saying the same thing to like a male, I don't know, usually white male, like museum director as my colleague who's standing next to me, same age, but who's a man. I feel like they always take the men more seriously. I don't
mm,
know why. I don't know. This is just completely subjective or my experience. But I
interesting.
think things has gotten much better, and I
You do
feel
this.
like,
Okay.
yeah, I
That's
think it's gotten much better. Like
there's
there's
that.
much more female artists, and I
Mhm.
feel like the older male male like kind of authoritative figures in the art world, I felt like they've learned to be more respectful of younger or like female artists.
Sure. So we had a question about the work behind you. Could you expand on that?
Oh, This is a piece of shell. Like I was picking up these um, shells from Vietnam on the beaches where they, I guess, like industrial, like big companies, they throw away industrial waste.
Mm.
They're using shells for something, but then they threw a bunch, like tons of them away. And then so I picked them up and I blew each one up individually. And then so
Wow.
you can see that inside the shell, under when it's lit with light, and when the light is like underneath it, then there are all these growth patterns. And then
They
like
look
if you
almost like veins. They look almost like you're inside of a kind of ear canal or something because there's all these veins in them.
and then you can see like how different each one is. So it's just kind of the idea of, like this also another shell.
Mm,
So it's
cool.
like how it's about how we look at things. If we
Hmm.
change our perspective, how we see things.
Wow, that's sort of the theme of this conversation, it sounds like, by the
Yeah.
end. If we just change our perspective, and it's true, if we just opened up our understanding of other existences in the world, this is will hopefully make it a better place. Um, Alka has a question. Will the themes of your work change after the pandemic?
The things.
Yeah, so you touched
Um,
upon, go ahead.
Actually, I think all my things, even my previous work, my perspective on my work really changed. Like for example, like it just happened during the pandemic in Seoul. The work that I was exhibiting is called Bardo, and it's about the intermediate stage when the consciousness leaves the body
Oh, wow.
and the journey of the consciousness. So I felt like with the same works, like the context really changed.
Hmm.
And also because there's just so much death, especially in South Korea. And I felt like people really relate to the work much differently than before. And then that was the response that I got from the museum. And
Oh,
then
so existing works in hindsight are being viewed in a different way because of
yeah,
what,
I
okay.
mean that's something that's more immediate because in the future, I mean I don't think the things will change, but I think I want to try to change my studio practice in terms
Mm,
of being more attentive to the materials that I use and its environmental impact. And
mhm.
so, like right now, I'm talking to some friends in France. They start like a more, for example, like some of my friends in France, they're studying how to use plant-based dye to print, to make prints, because
Yeah.
actually, like photographs and like printing is one of the biggest ways. I mean, in my work, I tend to use natural materials, so it's not like that bad. But I do
Mhm.
make photographs, and then so right now I'm trying out also some ethical paint
Mhm.
instead of using like ready-made um,
Yeah.
materials that are shipped from Europe.
Na
So I think,
natural
yeah,
natural
more for
dyes.
my practice. I want to shift my studio practice more than the topics that I'm exploring.
Mm, interesting.
What? Yeah.
Um, we have probably should wrap up now. There was one last question, which I think we kind of touched upon. You experiencing different states of consciousness through your work, and I didn't know if you wanted to expand on anything beyond what we discussed. That the sutras and the performance elements have helped you to kind of discover your own spirituality. Was there anything else you wanted to say about that before we wrap up?
I think sometimes like when I'm writing the sutras in front of an audience versus when I'm writing alone in my studio, I realize like you really feel the vibration from the audience. And
Mm,
I thought
interesting.
that's something that's interesting because if I were only to practice in my own studio, and these things were never exhibited publicly, so it's just my own spiritual journey. And I feel like it can easily become something that I just romanticize about, like alone by myself.
Interesting, yeah.
But because I'm doing things publicly, I get a lot of challenges, and a lot of, you know, people are challenging me, like, oh, why, like maybe they think I'm propagating a religion, or they're like, I don't understand the text. What's, you know, what's the point? This kind of challenges, then it makes me go deeper into the work. And then another, because in most spiritual tradition, the two focus is on wisdom, like that can be gained through cultivating your oneself. But then there's another side, which is the compassion part. Then if I'm not in touch with anybody, if I'm in my own cave, then I don't know. Then it would just be my whole big fantasy about a spiritual journey with
I know what you
myself.
mean. It's like, why make work if people can't see and enjoy and get something from it for themselves, potentially. Some artists do just make work for themselves, and it doesn't matter if anybody sees it or experiences it. But it sounds like that's an important part for you.
Yeah, I think the exchange has really helped me too.
Yeah. Great. Well, this exchange has been fabulous. Thank you so much again, Charwei, for joining us all the way from Taipei. I know it's getting late. And yeah, I hope that we can see more from you and work with you some more, and that you'll be back in the UK, hopefully in the not too distant future. But keep us posted on what's next for you. And yeah, thanks so much. I'm just going to give a quick shout out. Our last interview with Shazad from 2 weeks ago is now on YouTube with subtitles. We're going to try and get this one subtitled as well, so that everyone can see it and share it. And the next one is with Timur Sitchin on Wednesday, July 8th at 3 o'clock, same time. I hope to see you all there. Thanks so much, everyone, for the kind comments, and speak to you again soon, Charwei. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.